Jeremiah Crumpet was having what could only be described as the worst day in the history of bad days, and considering that the history of bad days included such memorable entries as the day the universe forgot how gravity worked, and the Great Galactic Tax Audit of 2387, this was saying something quite significant indeed. His restaurant, the Cosmic Spoon, had just been shut down by health inspectors who claimed that serving food to 17 different alien species without proper xenobiological permits was a catastrophic violation of intergalactic safety protocols. The fact that Jeremiah had been successfully feeding these 17 species for 3 years without so much as a case of mild indigestion seemed to be entirely irrelevant to the bureaucratic minds that governed such matters. 17 species! He had shouted at Inspector Zecht, a particularly humorless Rigelian, with the personality of a wet towel that had been left out in the rain for several weeks, and then forgotten in a closet for even longer. "I've been feeding half the galaxy for 3 years, and nobody's died yet." "Yet," Inspector Zecht had replied, with the kind of bureaucratic smugness that could curdle milk at 50 paces and probably had similar effects on other dairy products throughout the local galactic cluster. "The key word is yet, Mr. Crumpet. Your establishment lacks proper atmospheric filtration for methane-breathing species, adequate temperature controls for silicon-based life forms, and don't even get me started on your complete absence of quantum-stabilized serving utensils." "Quantum-stabilized serving utensils?" Jeremiah had asked, genuinely bewildered. For beings whose molecular structure exists in multiple dimensions simultaneously, Inspector Zecht had explained, with the patience of someone who had clearly given this lecture many times before. Without proper quantum anchoring, you could accidentally serve them their own lunch from last Tuesday, or worse, next Thursday's breakfast. The temporal paradox implications alone could destabilize local spacetime. But nobody's complained about temporal paradoxes. That's because they haven't happened yet, or they have happened, but won't happen until they do. Temporal mechanics is complicated, Mr. Crumpet. That's why we have regulations. And with that, Inspector Zecht had stamped Jeremiah's operating license with a stamp that seemed to exist in 7 dimensions at once and probably required its own insurance policy. So there Jeremiah sat, in his empty restaurant, staring at the last meal he'd ever cooked professionally, a simple plate of scrambled eggs, bacon and toast. The irony wasn't lost on him that after mastering the culinary preferences of beings with 6 stomachs, crystalline digestive systems that required specific mineral supplements, creatures who absorbed nutrients through photosynthesis and insisted on eating near windows, and one memorable customer who absorbed nutrients through his feet and had very particular opinions about floor cleanliness, his final creation was the most human thing imaginable. The eggs were perfectly scrambled, fluffy and golden, seasoned with just a touch of salt and pepper. The bacon was crispy without being burned, with just the right amount of fat to make it interesting. The toast was golden brown, with butter melting into every delicious pore. It was, he reflected, probably the best breakfast he'd ever made, which seemed like the kind of cosmic joke the universe particularly enjoyed playing on people who were having the worst day in recorded history. The restaurant itself was a monument to multicultural dining taken to its logical extreme. The tables were designed to accommodate everything from standard humanoid anatomy to beings who existed as sentient geometric shapes. The atmosphere was carefully controlled to provide breathable air for oxygen breathers, a methane-rich section for the Andromedans, and a special vacuum chamber for the energy beings who found physical matter to be an unnecessary complication. The menu had been a work of art that had taken Jeremiah 3 years to perfect. It included everything from traditional Earth comfort food to exotic dishes like Rigelian nerve soup, which was actually just chicken noodle soup with some interesting spices, but the name made the Rigelians feel at home, Andromedan methane fondue, which was surprisingly popular despite the obvious challenges of serving molten cheese to beings who breathed methane, and photosynthetic salad supreme, which was essentially a salad served under very bright lights. But the plant-based customers loved it. But now it was all over. The dream of creating the galaxy's first truly inclusive restaurant had died the death of 1,000 bureaucratic cuts, each one delivered with the precision of a surgeon and the compassion of a tax collector. The door chimed, and in walked the most pathetic creature Jeremiah had ever seen. And considering that he'd seen a lot of pathetic creatures in his time, including a particularly depressed black hole that had started a support group for celestial objects with abandonment issues, this was saying something. It looked like someone had taken a praying mantis, stretched it to 7 feet tall, given it the posture of a question mark written by someone with severe arthritis, and then forgotten to feed it for approximately 6 months. Its forearms hung limply at its sides like broken marionette strings, and its compound eyes had the dull sheen of someone who'd given up on life entirely and was now just going through the motions of existing out of habit. The creature's exoskeleton, which should have been a vibrant green, had faded to the color of old lettuce left in the back of a refrigerator. Its antennae drooped so dramatically that they nearly touched the floor, and when it moved, it did so with the careful deliberation of someone who wasn't entirely sure their limbs would continue to function if they moved too quickly. "We are closed," the creature wheezed in standard galactic, its voice carrying the weight of infinite sadness and what sounded like the early stages of respiratory failure. "Yeah, I know," Jeremiah sighed, looking around at his empty restaurant with its carefully arranged tables, each one designed to accommodate a different form of alien anatomy. "Health inspectors shut me down. Something about quantum-stabilized serving utensils and temporal paradox insurance. Apparently, I was one improperly anchored fork away from accidentally destroying the space-time continuum." The alien's head tilted in a way that suggested this was somehow both deeply unfair and completely unsurprising. "Bureaucracy," it said, and somehow managed to pack an entire civilization's worth of frustration into that single word. "Tell me about it," Jeremiah muttered, "but you look like you haven't eaten in weeks. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" The alien's head tilted in a way that suggested this question was somehow deeply philosophical, like asking about the meaning of life or why hot dogs came in packages of 10, but hot dog buns came in packages of 8. Define the proper food, actual food, not nutrient paste or compressed algae wafers or whatever passes for cuisine on your homeworld. I mean something that was actually prepared with care by someone who gave a damn about whether it tasted good. Ah, the creature's antennae drooped even further, which Jeremiah hadn't thought was physically possible. In that case, 17 cycles. 17 cycles. What's a cycle? Roughly equivalent to your months. Jeremiah stared at the alien for a long moment, then looked down at his scrambled eggs. The eggs stared back, still steaming, completely unaware they were about to become part of the most important meal in galactic history. The bacon lay beside them, crispy and perfect, while the toast sat golden and buttered, the very picture of terrestrial comfort food. "Sit down," he said, "but you said you were closed. Sit down." The alien, who would later introduce himself as Clicksnorp of the Vegan Collective, a name that would cause considerable confusion among Earth vegans for generations to come, folded his impossibly long limbs into a chair that had been designed for beings with significantly fewer joints and a much more straightforward relationship with gravity. The chair, which was part of Jeremiah's custom furniture collection, automatically adjusted itself to accommodate Clicksnorp's unique anatomy. The seat extended and reconfigured. The backrest shifted to provide proper support for his unusual posture, and the armrests repositioned themselves to accommodate his forearms. It was a marvel of engineering that had cost Jeremiah a small fortune, but seeing the look of surprise and gratitude on Clicksnorp's face as he settled into the first comfortable seat he'd probably sat in for months made every credit worth it. Jeremiah placed the plate in front of him with the kind of ceremony usually reserved for religious rituals or peace treaties. Eat. I have no currency. Did I ask for currency? Klicksnorp stared at the plate as if it might explode, transform into a small angry animal, or do something else equally unexpected. His compound eyes, each one no larger than a pinhead, but incredibly expressive when taken together, seemed to be conducting some kind of internal debate about the nature of kindness and whether it could possibly exist in a universe that had consistently demonstrated its preference for the opposite. What is this?" he asked, his voice filled with the kind of wonder usually reserved for discovering new forms of mathematics or finding out that someone had actually read the instruction manual. "It's called breakfast," Jeremiah explained, settling into the chair across from him. "The yellow stuff is eggs, unfertilized reproductive cells of a bird called a chicken. The strips are cured meat from a pig, which is a small mammal that Earth humans have been eating for thousands of years. The brown rectangles are sliced bread, made from wheat flour, water and yeast, then toasted until crispy and buttered." The description seemed to disturb Klicksnorp greatly. His antennae twitched in what was clearly distress, and his compound eyes seemed to be processing this information with the kind of horror usually reserved for discovering that one's entire life had been a simulation. "You eat reproductive cells. Don't think about it too hard," Jeremiah advised. "Most of the best food doesn't make a lot of sense when you really think about it. I mean, who was the first person to look at a cow and think, I bet the liquid that comes out of that thing would taste great with cookies? But here we are, and milk is delicious. But how do you know it's safe? Because I've been eating this stuff my whole life, and I'm still here. Plus, I've served variations of this meal to probably 50 different species over the years, and nobody's died yet. Well, except for that one incident with the Centaurian ambassador, but that was because he was allergic to temporal fluctuations, not the food itself." Klicksnorp looked dubious. Temporal fluctuations. Long story. Apparently some beings exist across multiple time streams simultaneously, and certain proteins can cause them to experience all their meals at once. Very uncomfortable, according to the medical report. But that's not going to happen to you, because you're clearly a linear time being, and besides, this is just regular Earth food with no temporal complications whatsoever. Just eat it. Just eat it. What happened next would be debated by xenobiologists for centuries, analyzed by philosophers throughout the galaxy, and eventually become the subject of at least 17 different doctoral dissertations on the nature of cross-species culinary experience. Klicksnorp took a tentative bite of scrambled egg, his mandibles working carefully, clearly prepared for the worst. His compound eyes widened in what could only be described as shock, followed rapidly by disbelief, then wonder, and finally something that looked suspiciously like religious ecstasy. He took another bite, this time with less caution and more enthusiasm, then another. Then he made a sound that can only be described as what a dying walrus might sound like if it suddenly discovered the meaning of life, won the lottery, and found out that its favorite television show had been renewed for 17 more seasons, all at the same time. "By the 7 moons of Rigel," he gasped, switching to what Jeremiah would later learn was the Vegan equivalent of a religious exclamation roughly equivalent to shouting, "Holy motherfucking shit!" in a cathedral during Easter service. "What sorcery is this? What dark magic have you woven into these impossible eggs?" "It's butter," Jeremiah said dryly, watching with fascination as Klicksnorp's entire body began to vibrate with what appeared to be pure joy. "And a little bit of salt. Maybe some pepper. The secret is low heat and constant stirring. Oh, and caring about whether it turns out good." "Caring?" Klicksnorp's voice rose to a pitch that probably scared small animals several star systems away. "You mean this transcendent experience, this moment of pure gustatory enlightenment, is the result of caring?" Well, that and good technique. You can care all you want, but if you cook the eggs too fast, they'll turn into rubber. It's all about the temperature control But Klicksnorp wasn't listening anymore. He had moved on to the bacon, and the sound he made upon tasting it was even more disturbing than his reaction to the eggs. It was the sound of someone experiencing a religious conversion, a mathematical breakthrough, and the discovery of true love all at once. His antennae shot straight up. His compound eyes began to glow with an inner light that definitely hadn't been there before, and his entire exoskeleton seemed to shimmer with newfound vitality. This crispy meat substance, he gasped between bites. It's like concentrated happiness. It's like eating pure joy. How is such a thing possible? It's pig, Jeremiah explained, beginning to wonder if he should be documenting this reaction for science. We cure it with salt and smoke it and— Pig! Klicksnorp's voice reached frequencies that were probably illegal in several star systems. You mean this divine substance comes from an animal? A living creature that was transformed into this masterpiece of flavor? Well, when you put it like that, it sounds kind of morbid. But yeah, basically. Klicksnorp stared at the remaining bacon with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts or really good parking spots. On my world, we subsist on processed nutrient compounds synthesized from atmospheric gases and mineral deposits. The concept of deriving sustenance from actual organic life forms is barbaric. Brilliant, Klicksnorp practically shouted. Why did no one think of this before? Why are we wasting time with synthetic compounds when there are animals that can be transformed into this? Jeremiah was starting to worry that he might have accidentally created some kind of carnivorous monster. But then Klicksnorp moved on to the toast, and his reaction somehow managed to become even more extreme. The first bite of buttered toast produced what could only be described as a full-body experience. Klicksnorp's forearms flailed wildly. His compound eyes rolled back in what looked like ecstasy, and he made a sound that was part moan, part sigh, and part aria from an opera about the transcendent nature of baked goods. "The bread!" he wailed, clutching the toast like it was the most precious thing in the universe. How do you make something so simple yet so perfect? It's like eating concentrated sunshine. It's like biting into the very essence of agricultural triumph. It's just bread with butter, Jeremiah said. But he was beginning to realize that his casual relationship with food was probably not shared by most of the galaxy. Wheat, yeast, water, heat. Humans have been making it for thousands of years. Thousands of years? Klicksnorp's voice cracked with emotion. Your species has possessed this knowledge for millennia, and you haven't shared it with the galaxy. This is food hoarding? A tragedy of cosmic proportions. Klicksnorp consumed the entire plate in approximately 37 seconds, a feat that would have been impressive if it hadn't been slightly terrifying. He ate with the desperate intensity of someone who had been wandering in a desert for years and had just discovered an oasis. Except the oasis was made of breakfast food and apparently contained the meaning of life. When he finished, he sat back in his chair and began to weep. Not the gentle weeping of someone moved by beauty, but the ugly, body-shaking sobs of someone who had just remembered what it felt like to be alive, to experience pleasure, to believe that the universe might actually contain good things after all. I had forgotten, he whispered through his tears, his voice broken with emotion. I had forgotten that food could be more than just fuel. On my world, eating is a necessity, a chore, something to be endured. But this was an experience. This was art. Jeremiah felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of pride and sadness that he didn't quite know how to handle. When's the last time you enjoyed a meal? Enjoyed? Klicksnorp looked at him as if the word were foreign, which it probably was. I don't think I ever have. Our food is designed for efficiency, for maximum nutritional value with minimum resource expenditure. The concept of enjoyment was not a consideration. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. It was, until 17 minutes ago. Now it is merely the prologue to a much better story. Klicksnorp stood suddenly, with such force that he knocked over his chair, which immediately began reconfiguring itself back to its default position with the quiet efficiency of well-designed furniture. His entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the pathetic, defeated creature who had stumbled into the restaurant. In his place stood someone who looked like he had just discovered fire, electricity, and the internet all at the same time. "I must go," he declared, his voice ringing with newfound purpose and determination. I must. You must what? "I must tell them," Klicksnorp whispered, his voice filled with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious experiences or really good concert tickets. "I must tell them all." Tell them what, exactly? That salvation exists, that there is hope, that somewhere in this cold, unfeeling universe there is a human who can transform simple ingredients into miracles. His voice was growing stronger, more confident with each word. That the great mystery of existence is not why we suffer, but why we have been suffering when this, he gestured at the empty plate, exists. "It's just breakfast," Jeremiah protested weakly. "No!" Klicksnorp's voice boomed with the authority of someone who had just experienced enlightenment and was not about to let anyone diminish it. "It is proof that the universe is not entirely without mercy. Proof that there are those who create beauty instead of merely consuming it." And with that declaration, he scuttled out of the restaurant with the urgent purpose of someone who had just discovered the cure for death and needed to tell everyone about it immediately. The door chimed behind him, leaving Jeremiah alone with his dirty dishes, his empty restaurant, and a growing sense that he might have just made a terrible mistake. "I should probably clean up," he muttered to himself, looking at the plate that had contained what was apparently the most important meal in galactic history, and maybe start looking for a new job, something quiet, something that doesn't involve accidentally starting religious movements with breakfast food. But even as he said it, he couldn't quite shake the image of Klicksnorp's face when he had tasted that first bite of eggs. It had been the expression of someone discovering that life was worth living after all. And despite the growing certainty that he had just set some kind of cosmic disaster in motion, Jeremiah found himself smiling. After all, when was the last time anyone had reacted to his cooking like it was the answer to the fundamental questions of existence? The answer, he reflected as he began washing dishes, was never. And maybe that was worth whatever was about to happen. What happened was that Jeremiah was awakened the next morning by what sounded like the entire percussion section of the London Symphony Orchestra had decided to relocate to his front door, possibly after consuming several energy drinks and deciding that 6 a.m. was the perfect time for an impromptu concert. He stumbled out of bed, threw on his bathrobe, which featured a pattern of smiling pancakes that seemed inappropriate for the gravity of the situation, and shuffled to the door with the weary resignation of someone who had spent the last 12 hours trying to convince himself that yesterday had been an unusually vivid dream. The sound continued, a rhythmic, thunderous pounding that seemed to be coming from multiple sources at once. It was accompanied by what sounded like alien chanting, the hum of spacecraft engines, and at least 17 different types of background music, none of which seemed to be in the same key. "What the fuck?" he shouted at the door, using the kind of language that his mother would have disapproved of, but which seemed entirely appropriate given the circumstances. The pounding stopped. Then a voice, Klicksnorp's voice, but somehow amplified to the point where it could probably be heard on neighboring planets, boomed from outside. "Great Chefmaster Crumpet, we humbly request an audience." Jeremiah stared at the door for a long moment, trying to process the phrase "Great Chefmaster" and failing completely. Then he opened the door. The sight that greeted him was so surreal that his first instinct was to check if he was still dreaming, possibly by pinching himself or looking for flying purple elephants or other reliable dream indicators. His small apartment building was surrounded by what appeared to be every spaceship in the local galactic cluster. They ranged from sleek diplomatic vessels that looked like they had been designed by artists with advanced degrees in making things look impossibly beautiful, to massive war cruisers that looked like they could crack planets for fun and probably had, to smaller personal craft that seemed to have been built by species with very different ideas about aerodynamics. The ships were arranged in perfect formation, creating concentric circles around his building like some kind of automotive crop circle. Between the ships, temporary structures had been erected, what looked like command tents, communication arrays, and at least 17 different types of alien barbecue grills, which seemed oddly ominous given the circumstances. And kneeling on his doorstep, in perfect formation, were approximately 200 of the most dangerous-looking beings he'd ever seen. At the front of this unlikely congregation was Klixnorp, but a version of Klixnorp that Jeremiah barely recognized. Gone was the pathetic, malnourished creature from yesterday. This Klixnorp wore ceremonial armor that seemed to be made of crystallized starlight and probably cost more than most planets. His posture suggested someone who could order the destruction of solar systems before breakfast and then critique the efficiency of the operation. Behind him, arranged in neat rows, were beings that looked like they had stepped out of a military recruitment poster for the galaxy's most elite fighting forces. There were massive creatures that appeared to be made of living rock, graceful beings that seemed to be composed of pure energy held together by willpower and good intentions, and at least 7 different types of what could only be described as organic war machines. Said Jeremiah, because sometimes the human brain simply refuses to provide adequate vocabulary for certain situations. What? Great Chef-Master Crumpet! Klixnorp's voice boomed across the courtyard, with the kind of authority that could make black holes reconsider their life choices, and probably had. We, the War Council of the Vegan Collective, humbly request your guidance in the sacred arts of feeding. War Council? Jeremiah's voice cracked slightly, the way voices tend to when confronted with information that fundamentally challenges their understanding of reality. Yesterday, you looked like you were about to die from hunger. I was dying, Klixnorp replied solemnly, his voice carrying the weight of genuine tragedy and what sounded like survivor's guilt. We all were. The Great Famine has ravaged our worlds for 7 cycles. Our traditional food sources have failed due to industrial accidents, bureaucratic incompetence, and what our scientists have classified as really bad luck. Our people starve while our enemies grow fat on the bounty of conquered worlds and take out from really good restaurants. Behind Klixnorp, a massive creature that looked like a cross between a rhinoceros and a filing cabinet stepped forward. Its hide was scarred with what appeared to be battle damage, and its eyes held the kind of weariness that comes from fighting the same war for way too long. I am War Leader Gronthak of the Proxima Syndicate, it rumbled in a voice like grinding tectonic plates having an argument. My people have been at war with the Vegans for 300 years over territorial disputes, trade routes, and what started as a disagreement about the proper pronunciation of the word quasar. Yesterday, this one came to our flagship with tales of a human who could create sustenance from the very essence of life itself. It's just scrambled eggs, Jeremiah protested, his voice rising to the pitch usually reserved for explaining to customer service representatives that you really did pay your bill on time. He spoke of magic, continued another voice, this one belonging to a being that seemed to be made entirely of geometric shapes, held together by pure mathematics and what looked like very advanced engineering, of taking the simplest ingredients and transforming them into something that could restore the will to live, the desire to continue existing, and the fundamental belief that the universe might not be entirely hostile to organic life. That's just good seasoning. We have come, said a fourth voice, this one emanating from what appeared to be a sentient cloud of purple gas, wearing what might have been a military uniform, if military uniforms were designed for beings without fixed physical form, to learn the secrets of the great feeding. Jeremiah looked around at the assembled warlords, each representing civilizations that had been locked in eternal conflict, all kneeling before his apartment like he was some kind of culinary messiah. The absurdity of the situation hit him like a freight train, carrying a cargo of cosmic irony and traveling at the speed of pure surrealism. "You do realize," he said slowly, trying to inject some sanity into what was rapidly becoming the most bizarre morning of his life, "that I just got shut down by health inspectors yesterday, right? I'm not legally allowed to serve food to anyone, let alone 200 military leaders from warring civilizations." The assembled warlords exchanged glances that somehow managed to convey several centuries of military strategy, political maneuvering, and what appeared to be a shared understanding of how to deal with bureaucratic obstacles. "Inspector Zizikt," war leader Gronthak said, with the kind of casual menace that suggested he'd dealt with bureaucrats before and had developed effective methods for ensuring their cooperation, "has been reassigned to a very distant monitoring station, in a very dark part of space, where the nearest backup is approximately 17 light-years away and the coffee is terrible." "Oh," said Jeremiah, processing this information with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching natural disasters or reality television. "Oh no! Fear not, great chef master." Klicksnorp stood, his armor catching the morning sunlight in a way that was probably visible from orbit and definitely painful to look at directly. "He lives. He simply has new perspective on the importance of culinary arts to galactic stability. Also, his new assignment comes with excellent health benefits and a retirement plan that kicks in after only 50 years of service." This was, Jeremiah reflected, probably the strangest thing anyone had ever said to him while he was wearing pancake pajamas. "Look," he said, trying to inject some sanity into what was rapidly becoming the most bizarre morning of his life. "I appreciate the gesture, but I just make food. I'm not some kind of mystical chef wizard. I can't solve your wars with breakfast. I can't bring peace to the galaxy with pancakes. I can't end suffering with a really good sandwich." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that makes you realize you've said something either profoundly wise or catastrophically stupid, and the universe hasn't decided which one yet. "With respect, great chef master," said the geometric being, its mathematical precision somehow conveying gentle correction and what might have been the quantum equivalent of a patient smile, "you already have." And that's when Jeremiah noticed something that made his knees go weak and his understanding of reality perform what could only be described as a complete structural collapse. Every single one of these warlords, these beings who had spent centuries trying to kill each other over territorial disputes, trade routes, and pronunciation disagreements, were sitting peacefully in the same space. The natural enemies were sharing the same air without reaching for weapons. The hereditary foes were having what appeared to be polite conversations about the weather, local sports teams, and what looked like recipe exchanges. The massive rock creature that had been introduced as representing the asteroid mining consortium was deep in conversation with a being that appeared to be made of liquid mercury, and they seemed to be discussing the finer points of temperature control in cooking. The sentient purple gas cloud was exchanging what appeared to be business cards with a creature that looked like it had been assembled from spare starship parts, and a really good imagination. "How long?" he asked weakly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Have you all been here?" "Since dawn," Klicksnorp replied cheerfully. "We have been discussing terms." "Terms? For the Great Armistice," War Leader Gronthak explained, as if this should be obvious to anyone with basic reasoning skills and a functioning knowledge of cause and effect. "Wars are expensive. Wars are time-consuming. Wars prevent proper appreciation of culinary arts. We have agreed to suspend all hostilities pending your instruction in the sacred arts of feeding." The purple gas cloud pulsed thoughtfully, its color shifting to what might have been the chromatic equivalent of mild amusement. Also, it turns out we all rather enjoy arguing about recipe modifications more than we enjoy orbital bombardment. Who knew? The Andromedan delegation has some fascinating theories about the proper way to season vegetables, and the Centaurian Empire apparently makes a soup that could revolutionize interstellar nutrition. Jeremiah stared at them all for a long moment, trying to process the information that he had somehow accidentally ended several centuries' worth of interstellar warfare by sharing his breakfast with a hungry alien. Then he slowly closed the door. He counted to 10. Then he counted to 20. Then he opened the door again. They were all still there, still kneeling, still looking at him with the kind of expectant faith usually reserved for small children asking adults to fix their broken toys or explain why the sky is blue. "This is insane," he muttered. "Yes," agreed Clicksnorp cheerfully, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had fully embraced the absurdity of the situation and was enjoying every minute of it. "But it's the good kind of insane. The kind that doesn't involve massive casualties, decades of reconstruction, and really depressing war memorials. The kind," added war leader Gronthak thoughtfully, "that might actually solve problems instead of creating them." And so began the most unlikely chapter in galactic history. Jeremiah Crumpet, failed restaurateur and accidental peace negotiator, found himself teaching the art of scrambled eggs to beings who had previously considered each other suitable only for target practice and occasionally creative insults. The lessons were challenging. War leader Gronthak had a tendency to overcook everything because his species' idea of properly heated was roughly equivalent to the surface temperature of Mercury during a particularly enthusiastic solar flare. His first attempt at scrambled eggs had resulted in what could only be described as egg-flavored charcoal and a small fire that had required the intervention of 3 different types of fire suppression systems. "Feel the heat," Jeremiah instructed patiently for the 14th time. "Don't fight it. Work with it. Cooking is about partnership, not domination." But my people have always believed that heat must be conquered," Gronthak protested, his massive frame radiating the kind of intensity usually reserved for declaring war on small nations. "We take the fire, and we bend it to our will." "That's probably why your food tastes like it was prepared in a blast furnace," the geometric being observed mildly, its form shifting into what might have been the mathematical equivalent of a shrug. "Perhaps a more collaborative approach?" The geometric being, who had introduced himself as Hexagon Prime, which seemed redundant, but Jeremiah wasn't about to argue with a sentient mathematical concept, kept trying to calculate the exact mathematical relationship between butter and happiness. This had led to some truly bizarre experiments involving fractal seasoning patterns, geometric egg arrangements, and what appeared to be an attempt to express the essence of breakfast through pure mathematical notation. "You see," Hexagon Prime explained, his form shifting into a complex 3-dimensional graph, "if we can quantify the relationship between ingredient ratios and emotional satisfaction, we can create a universal formula for optimal nutrition across all species. Or," Jeremiah suggested gently, "you could just taste it and see if it's good. But that's so imprecise, so subjective, so unscientific." "Yes," agreed Jeremiah. "That's what makes it work." The purple gas cloud, who called himself Nebulous the questionably corporeal, couldn't actually eat anything in the traditional sense, but insisted on providing color commentary that was both deeply philosophical and completely unhelpful. "Consider," Nebulous intoned in his ethereal voice, while Jeremiah attempted to demonstrate proper whisking technique, "the metaphysical implications of transforming potential energy into kinetic pleasure. Are we not in essence participating in the fundamental alchemy of existence itself?" "We're making eggs," Jeremiah said flatly. "But what are eggs, really? Are they not merely the crystallized dreams of yet-to-be chickens? And when we cook them, Are we not transforming those dreams into sustenance for our own reality? They're protein, Jeremiah replied, wondering if philosophy professors throughout the galaxy had similar conversations about everything they encountered, with some fat and sulfur compounds that taste good when you heat them up properly. Exactly, Nebulous exclaimed, his gaseous form pulsing with what appeared to be excitement. The very building blocks of life itself, reorganized through the application of thermal energy into a new configuration that transcends its original purpose. It's like cooking, suggested Clicksnorp, who had proven to be surprisingly adept at the actual practical aspects of food preparation. Yes, but more than cooking, it's transcendental cooking. It's just breakfast, Jeremiah muttered, but he was beginning to realize that his students saw something in the process that he had never considered. To them, the simple act of preparing food was a form of alchemy, a transformation of basic ingredients into something greater than the sum of its parts. You see, Jeremiah explained for the 100th time, after Gronthek had managed to produce eggs that were merely overcooked, rather than completely incinerated. The secret isn't in the complexity, it's in the care. You have to actually give a damn about the food you're making. Define damn, requested Hexagon Prime, his form shifting into what appeared to be a very precise question mark. It means you have to want the food to be good. You have to cook like it matters. Like someone you care about is going to eat it. But why does it matter? Asked Nebulous, his purple form swirling with what might have been confusion. In the grand scheme of cosmic entropy, what significance can one meal have? We are all merely temporary arrangements of matter in an expanding universe that will eventually collapse into heat death and perfect entropy. Jeremiah paused, spatula in hand, and looked around at his unlikely students. War Leader Gronthak was carefully adjusting the heat under his pan with the same precision he'd once used to target enemy installations. Clicksnorp was whisking eggs with the focused intensity of someone defusing a bomb. Hexagon Prime had stopped calculating and was simply watching the butter melt with something approaching wonder. Even Nebulous seemed to be paying attention, his gaseous form more stable and focused than usual. Because, he said finally, when you're hungry, really hungry, and someone takes the time to make you something good, it reminds you that someone gives a shit whether you live or die. And maybe that's worth not blowing up their planet. The silence that followed was broken only by the gentle sizzle of eggs cooking in butter, and what might have been the sound of several different species having simultaneous philosophical breakthroughs. Ah, said Nebulous softly, his voice carrying a note of wonder, the great feeding is not about the food. No, Jeremiah agreed. It's about remembering that we're all just hungry idiots trying to figure out how to not be hungry anymore. War Leader Gronthak looked up from his pan, where he was creating what could only be described as the most perfectly scrambled eggs in the history of his species. This is surprisingly profound for a breakfast food. Most important things are, Jeremiah replied. That's why people miss them. The cooking lessons continued for 3 weeks. Word spread through the galaxy faster than a quantum entanglement transmission and considerably faster than most government regulatory responses. Delegations arrived from species that had never shown interest in anything beyond their own borders. Trade agreements were signed over shared meals. Ancient grudges were forgotten in the face of properly seasoned vegetables. It wasn't all smooth sailing, of course. There was the incident with the Andromedan delegation, who insisted that their traditional method of food preparation involved ritual combat with their ingredients. This had resulted in what could only be described as the Great Lettuce Massacre of Tuesday morning, which had required extensive cleanup and a formal apology to the Vegetarian Rights Coalition. There was the Great Spatula Shortage of Week 2, when 17 different species decided they needed to import human cooking utensils immediately, leading to a brief but intense trade war over the rights to kitchen implement distribution. The conflict had been resolved when someone pointed out that they could just make their own spatulas, but not before 3 diplomatic incidents and what the media called the pan-handle crisis. And there was the unfortunate moment when war leader Gronthak accidentally created what could only be described as a breakfast weapon during an experiment with heat distribution. The resulting explosion had been contained, but it had created a small crater in the parking lot and a new type of scrambled egg that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously and probably violated several laws of physics. "I was attempting to achieve perfect thermal equilibrium," Gronthak explained to the emergency response team, his massive frame somehow managing to look sheepish despite being made of living rock. "I may have overcorrected." "You created a temporal breakfast paradox," the quantum physicist on the response team explained patiently. "The eggs exist in all possible states of cooking simultaneously. They're simultaneously raw, perfectly cooked, and burned to a crisp." "Are they edible?" asked Klicksnorp, with the kind of scientific curiosity that had probably gotten his species into trouble before. "We're not sure. Current theory suggests that eating them might cause the consumer to experience all possible breakfast experiences simultaneously, which could be either transcendent or catastrophic. Or both," added Hexagon Prime helpfully. "The mathematics are quite fascinating, actually." In the end, they had to call in a team of temporal engineers to safely dispose of the quantum eggs, but the incident had provided valuable data on the intersection of cooking and advanced physics, which several universities were apparently very excited about. But through it all, something remarkable was happening. The galaxy was learning to eat together. Species that had been enemies for centuries were sharing recipes and cooking techniques. The Rigelian Empire had developed a fusion cuisine that combined their traditional spice blends with human cooking methods, creating dishes that were reportedly transcendent and probably not toxic to most carbon-based life forms. The Andromedan Collective had embraced the concept of comfort food with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for military campaigns, and their new restaurants were apparently booked solid for the next 6 months. Even the energy beings, who didn't technically eat in any conventional sense, had found ways to participate. They had become the galaxy's premier food critics, using their ability to perceive energy patterns to analyze the spiritual essence of different dishes. Their reviews were reportedly both incomprehensible and utterly convincing. The breakthrough came during Week 3, when a distress signal arrived from the Outer Rim. A massive fleet of unknown ships had appeared at the edge of the galaxy and was systematically destroying everything in its path. The message was brief but urgent. They don't respond to hails. They don't negotiate. They just consume. The warlords looked at each other, then at Jeremiah, with the kind of expression usually reserved for moments when someone realizes they've forgotten to turn off the stove before leaving for vacation. "Well," said Klicksnorp, his voice carrying the tone of someone who had just discovered that the universe had a sense of humor, and it wasn't particularly funny. "This is awkward." "Indeed," agreed War Leader Gronthak, his massive frame radiating the kind of tension that usually preceded either violence or very difficult conversations. "How does one offer breakfast to entities that apparently eat entire planets?" The geometric being's form shifted into what might have been the mathematical equivalent of a shrug. "Perhaps we should ask the great chef master." All eyes turned to Jeremiah, who was having the distinct feeling that his life had taken a left turn into the Twilight Zone and decided to set up permanent residence there. "You want me to cook for planet-eating aliens?" he said slowly, trying to process the full absurdity of the situation. "It worked before," Nebulous pointed out helpfully, his purple form pulsing with what might have been optimism. "That was one hungry alien. These things are apparently eating entire worlds." "Details," War Leader Gronthak waved a massive appendage dismissively. "The principle remains the same, does it not? They consume because they are hungry. Therefore we feed them. Jeremiah stared at the assembled warlords, each representing the military might of their civilizations, all looking at him with the kind of expectant faith usually reserved for small children, asking adults to fix their broken toys or explain why bad things happen to good people. "You're all completely insane," he said finally. "Yes," they agreed in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was probably audible from several star systems away. "Will you help us anyway?" What followed was the largest cooking operation in galactic history. Every ship in the combined fleets was converted into a mobile kitchen, with industrial food processors, massive ovens that could prepare meals for beings the size of small moons, and refrigeration units that used actual pocket dimensions to store ingredients. Ingredients were sourced from across the galaxy through what could only be described as the fastest supply chain operation ever assembled. Grain shipments arrived from agricultural worlds, protein sources were transported in specialized cargo vessels, and spices were acquired from trade networks that spanned entire sectors. The scale was staggering. They were preparing to feed beings whose appetites apparently measured in planetary masses, which required rethinking everything they thought they knew about cooking. Recipe conversions that had previously involved simple multiplication now required advanced mathematics and what appeared to be at least 17 different types of scientific calculator. "How do you scramble eggs for something the size of a moon?" asked Clicksnorp, staring at calculations that covered several whiteboards and probably violated the space-time continuum. "Very carefully," replied Hexagon Prime, his form shifting into what appeared to be a complex equation involving cubic kilometers and thermal dynamics, and with really big pans. The unknown fleet arrived at the edge of the system 3 days later, and the first visual contact confirmed everyone's worst fears. They were massive, organic-looking vessels that seemed to pulse with a kind of predatory hunger. Each ship was the size of a small planet, with what appeared to be enormous digestive systems running through their cores. They moved with the kind of purposeful inevitability usually associated with natural disasters or tax collectors. Scans revealed them to be largely biological, with what appeared to be complex internal ecosystems and metabolic processes that defied most known science. They seemed to be powered by some kind of organic fusion process that converted matter directly into energy, which explained their apparent ability to consume entire worlds. "Well," said Jeremiah, standing on the bridge of the flagship, wearing a chef's hat that had been hastily constructed from military-grade materials and what appeared to be several types of radiation shielding, "I guess we're about to find out if diplomacy through dinner actually works on a cosmic scale." The first contact attempt was unlike anything in recorded history. Instead of the usual formal hails, diplomatic protocols and carefully worded messages designed to avoid giving offense to unknown alien sensibilities, the combined fleet broadcast a simple message: "We have prepared a meal. Would you like to try it?" The response was immediate and terrifying. The entire unknown fleet suddenly accelerated, heading straight for them with the kind of single-minded purpose that suggested they'd either misunderstood the invitation or understood it perfectly and were very, very hungry. "They're coming in fast!" shouted the tactical officer, his voice rising to the pitch usually reserved for announcing incoming disasters or really bad news about the stock market. "All ships, prepare for—" "Wait," Jeremiah said, studying the readouts with the kind of focus usually reserved for defusing bombs or trying to understand tax forms. "Look at their formation. They're not attacking. They're lining up." And indeed, the massive alien vessels were arranging themselves in what could only be described as a cosmic queue, as if they were waiting for their turn at the galaxy's largest drive-through window. It was the kind of orderly behavior that suggested either advanced intelligence or really good customer service training. What emerged from the first ship was unlike anything anyone had ever seen, even in a galaxy that prided itself on biological diversity and really creative evolution. It looked like someone had taken a whale, given it tentacles, covered it in crystalline scales, added what appeared to be several types of sensory organs that glowed with their own internal light, and then inflated it to the size of a small moon. Its eyes, each one larger than most starships, and possessing the kind of depth that suggested vast intelligence and possibly chronic depression, focused on the assembled fleet with an expression that was unmistakably hopeful. The creature moved with surprising grace for something that could probably use planets as paperweights, floating through space as if the laws of physics were merely suggestions that it was politely choosing to follow. When it spoke, its voice resonated through subspace and probably caused seismic activity on nearby planets. "Food?" it asked, and the single word carried such weight of desperate longing that several empathically sensitive crew members began weeping spontaneously. "You have food?" "We have food," Jeremiah replied, his voice amplified through the fleet's communication system and probably audible in several neighboring star systems. "Are you hungry?" What followed was a sound that can only be described as what the universe itself might sound like if it suddenly started crying from relief, loneliness, and the kind of desperate gratitude that comes from finally finding something you'd given up hope of ever experiencing again. So hungry, the massive being sobbed, its tears forming small lakes on the hull of its ship and creating what appeared to be temporary weather systems. "We have been hungry for so long. We eat worlds, but they taste like sadness and regret." "Well," said Jeremiah, trying to project confidence despite the fact that he was talking to something that could probably eat his entire planet as an appetizer, "I think we can do better than that." The second ship disgorged another creature, this one resembling a cross between a jellyfish and a small continent, with what appeared to be cities growing on its surface and transportation networks visible through its translucent skin. It moved with the kind of ponderous dignity usually associated with geological processes. "Brother speaks truth," it rumbled, its voice causing harmonic resonances in the hulls of nearby ships. "We consume because we must, but consumption without joy is merely existing. We had forgotten that nourishment could be more than mere survival." A third creature emerged, this one shaped like a living constellation, held together by what appeared to be concentrated starlight and good intentions. Its voice was like the sound of solar wind singing through asteroid fields. "We are the devourers of the deep void," it announced, somehow managing to make the name sound both menacing and deeply sad. "We have wandered the galaxy for millennia, consuming worlds not from malice, but from desperate, unending hunger. We do not know how to create, only how to consume, and consumption without creation is empty," finished Jeremiah, "like eating the container instead of the contents." "Yes!" all three creatures exclaimed simultaneously, creating a harmonic resonance that probably registered on seismographs throughout the system. "Exactly! How did you know?" "Because," Jeremiah said, settling into what was rapidly becoming his role as the galaxy's most unlikely therapist, "I've met a lot of hungry people, and hunger isn't just about food. It's about wanting something more than what you have, and not knowing how to get it." The great feeding that followed, lasted for 17 hours and required the coordinated efforts of every ship in the combined fleet, several emergency supply runs to agricultural worlds, and what could only be described as the most ambitious catering operation in galactic history. The Devourers, despite their intimidating name and world-eating reputation, turned out to be gentle giants who had been wandering the galaxy for millennia, consuming worlds not out of malice, but out of desperate, unending hunger, combined with a complete lack of knowledge about sustainable agriculture or basic cooking techniques. "We do not know how to make food," their leader explained between bites of what could only be described as a planet-sized omelette that had required the coordinated efforts of 300 ships and approximately 17 different types of heavy machinery. We only know how to consume, but consumption without creation is empty, like eating the container instead of the contents. It's about the seasoning, Jeremiah explained, though he was still struggling with the scale of the operation and the fact that he was giving cooking advice to beings who could use moons as dinner plates. And the caring. You have to put something of yourself into the food. But we are very large, another devourer pointed out, its massive form casting shadows across several star systems. If we put ourselves into the food, would there be room for anything else? Not literally, Jeremiah laughed, the sound somehow carrying across the void between ships and probably confusing several different types of deep space monitoring equipment. It's about intention, about wanting the food to be good for whoever's going to eat it. And the devourers considered this with the kind of profound concentration that usually preceded major philosophical breakthroughs or really important scientific discoveries. So, their leader said slowly, its voice carrying the weight of someone working through a complex problem, when we consumed worlds, we were doing it wrong. Well, you were certainly doing it inefficiently, War Leader Gronthak interjected, his massive rocky form somehow managing to project the air of someone who had strong opinions about resource management. Why destroy an entire biosphere when you could establish sustainable farming operations and enjoy fresh produce indefinitely? This observation led to what historians would later call the Great Galactic Agricultural Conference, during which the devourers learned about crop rotation, sustainable harvesting, soil management, companion planting, and the revolutionary concept of not eating the farmers. You mean, said one of the devourers, its massive form quivering with what appeared to be excitement, we could grow food that grows more food. That's basically how agriculture works, yes, confirmed Klicksnorp, who had become something of an expert on sustainable food production during his time learning to cook. And the farmers would help us, instead of running away screaming. If you don't eat them, probably. The transformation was remarkable. Within months, the devourers had converted their world-consuming capabilities into massive terraforming operations. They became the galaxy's most efficient agricultural producers, turning dead worlds into garden paradises and trading their surplus for the one thing they valued above all else, new recipes. Their first attempt at growing their own food had been ambitious. They had converted an entire uninhabited star system into what could only be described as the universe's largest organic farm, complete with custom-designed solar arrays to provide optimal growing conditions and irrigation systems that used carefully controlled comets to deliver water. The results had been spectacular. They had produced enough food to feed several galactic sectors and had done it using entirely sustainable methods that actually improved the local environment. Their tomatoes were reportedly the size of small asteroids and incredibly delicious. We had forgotten, the lead devourer had explained during the harvest celebration, that creation brings its own satisfaction. Consumption feeds the body, but creation feeds the soul. Plus, added another, homegrown food just tastes better. The piece that followed wasn't perfect, but it was remarkably stable for something that had been negotiated over breakfast and implemented by beings who had previously considered each other suitable only for target practice or creative insulting. There were still disputes, of course, but they tended to be settled through cook-offs rather than orbital bombardments. The Great Galactic Culinary Council was established, with Jeremiah as its somewhat reluctant chief advisor and Klicksnorp as its surprisingly effective Secretary of Interdisciplinary Nutrition. The Council's first major initiative was the establishment of the Universal Recipe Exchange, a vast database of cooking techniques and recipes from across the galaxy. Species that had never shared anything more significant than trade routes were now exchanging family recipes that had been closely guarded secrets for generations. The Rigelian Empire contributed their traditional spice blends, which required careful handling due to their tendency to achieve sentience if stored improperly. The Andromedan collective shared their fermentation techniques, which could apparently improve the flavor of almost anything, and had the added benefit of creating alcoholic beverages that were both delicious and capable of powering small spacecraft. Wars didn't end completely, but they became much shorter and significantly less destructive. It's hard to maintain proper hatred for someone when you've shared their grandmother's recipe for quantum soup or learned how to prepare their traditional comfort food. The few conflicts that did arise tended to be resolved quickly, often through what became known as culinary diplomacy. When the Centaurian Empire and the Vegan Collective got into a dispute over mining rights in the Horsehead Nebula, the conflict was resolved through a cook-off that lasted 3 days and produced some of the most innovative fusion cuisine in galactic history. It turns out, war leader Gronthak observed during the peace negotiations, that it's much easier to be angry at someone when you don't know what their favorite food is. The restaurant that emerged from all this was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. It occupied an entire space station, with sections designed for every known form of sentient life, and several that hadn't been discovered yet. The main dining area could accommodate beings ranging from microscopic energy creatures to planet-sized devourers, often at the same table through the creative use of scaling technology and really good engineering. The menu was updated daily, and included everything from traditional Earth comfort food to exotic delicacies that required careful handling by beings with natural resistance to radioactivity, temporal fluctuations, or really strong gravitational fields. There were sections for beings who ate sound waves, creatures who subsisted on mathematical concepts, and at least 17 different types of photosynthetic customers who preferred their meals served under very specific lighting conditions. But the most popular item, the one that beings traveled from across the galaxy to experience, remained the same simple meal that had started it all: scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. Prepared with care, seasoned with compassion, and served with the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do for someone is remember that they're hungry too. The dish had acquired an almost mythical status throughout the galaxy. Pilgrims would travel for months just to taste the meal that had ended wars and started friendships. Food critics would spend years analyzing the perfect balance of protein, fat, and carbohydrates that had somehow managed to bring peace to a galaxy that had been at war for centuries. But for all the analysis, all the scientific studies, and all the philosophical discussions about the nature of nourishment and its relationship to interspecies harmony, the secret remained simple. It was made with care by someone who wanted it to be good. Jeremiah never quite got used to being called the great chef master, though he did eventually learn to appreciate the irony of becoming famous for the simplest dish he knew how to make. He kept a small section of the restaurant reserved for walk-ins, beings who showed up hungry and alone, looking for something more than just food. These were often refugees from conflicts that had ended, soldiers returning from wars that were no longer being fought, or simply travelers who had been wandering the galaxy for so long that they had forgotten what it felt like to be welcomed somewhere. Jeremiah would serve them personally, often that same simple breakfast that had started everything, and listen to their stories. The thing about feeding people, he would tell his students during the cooking classes that had become a regular feature of the restaurant, is that you're not just filling their stomachs, you're reminding them that someone noticed they were hungry. And in a universe full of empty space and distant stars, sometimes that's the most important thing anyone can do. And The classes had become surprisingly popular, drawing students from across the galaxy who wanted to learn not just cooking techniques, but the philosophy behind them. The curriculum included everything from basic knife skills to advanced fusion cuisine, but the most important lesson was always the same. Cooking was about caring. Food is love made edible, Klicksnorp would often say during his guest lectures, a phrase that had become something of a motto for the culinary movement that had spread throughout the galaxy. When you prepare a meal for someone, you are saying, I want you to be happy, I want you to be nourished, I want you to know that you matter. The galaxy never quite figured out how to properly classify what had happened. It wasn't really a war, though it had involved more military hardware than most galactic conflicts. It wasn't really a peace treaty, though it had ended more disputes than centuries of formal diplomacy. It wasn't really a revolution, though it had fundamentally changed how civilizations interacted with each other. Historians struggled with the classification for years. Some called it the Great Feeding, others referred to it as the Breakfast Revolution. A few academic papers attempted to analyze it as a case study in culinary diplomacy or gastronomic peacekeeping. The Andromedan Empire's official history called it the day the galaxy learned to eat together, which was perhaps the most accurate description. But regardless of what it was called, everyone agreed that it had changed things. Trade routes that had been established for military purposes were now used to transport ingredients and recipes. Diplomatic missions that had once focused on territorial disputes now dealt with questions of menu planning and restaurant licensing. The Galactic Council had established a new department specifically for food-related international relations. The ripple effects continued to spread throughout the galaxy. Planets that had never had contact with other worlds were now part of vast culinary networks. Species that had been isolated by language barriers were communicating through shared recipes and cooking techniques. The universal language, it turned out, wasn't mathematics or music. It was hunger and the desire to satisfy it well. Even the most remote corners of the galaxy had been affected. Deep space exploration teams now carried not just emergency rations, but proper cooking equipment and instructions for preparing meals that could be shared with whatever life forms they might encounter. First contact protocols now included guidelines for food sharing and cultural exchange through cuisine. It's remarkable, observed Dr. Quantum Smith of the Galactic Anthropological Institute during a conference on interspecies cultural exchange, how quickly civilizations that had been enemies for centuries adapted to this new paradigm. It suggests that the capacity for peaceful coexistence was always there. It just needed the right catalyst. The right catalyst, agreed his colleague, Dr. Jones, turned out to be scrambled eggs. The transformation hadn't been without its challenges, of course. There had been the great spice wars of Year 2, when several civilizations had gotten into heated disputes over trade routes for exotic seasonings. The conflict had been resolved through the establishment of the Galactic Spice Exchange, which ensured fair distribution of culinary resources throughout all member systems. There had been the protein panic of Year 3, when rumors of a synthetic meat substitute that could replace traditional protein sources had caused widespread economic disruption. The crisis had been averted when it was discovered that the substitute, while nutritionally equivalent, tasted like sadness and cardboard, according to unanimous taste test results. And there had been the ongoing challenge of accommodating the dietary needs of species whose idea of a good meal involved things like consuming pure energy, digesting concepts, or absorbing nutrients through interpretive dance. But each challenge had been met with creativity, patience, and the growing understanding that diversity in dining was a strength, not a problem, to be solved. The galaxy, Jeremiah often reflected during quiet moments in his restaurant, is a much more interesting place when everyone's trying to figure out how to feed each other instead of how to fight each other. He had become something of a philosopher in his old age, though he would have been the first to deny it. Students would come from across the galaxy to hear his thoughts on food, life, and the connection between them. His most famous lecture on the existential significance of breakfast had been translated into over 300 languages and was required reading in xenoanthropology courses throughout the galaxy. But despite all the fame, all the recognition, and all the honorary doctorates from universities he'd never heard of, Jeremiah's favorite part of each day remained the same. The moment when a hungry person tasted good food and remembered what it felt like to be cared for. The universe, he would tell anyone who would listen, is vast and cold and mostly empty, but every time someone takes the time to cook a good meal for someone else, it gets a little warmer, and maybe that's enough. The restaurant had spawned a franchise operation that now spanned the galaxy, with locations on every inhabited world and several uninhabited ones that had been specifically terraformed for dining purposes. Each location maintained the same core philosophy: good food, served with care, to anyone who was hungry. The franchise had become so successful that its stock was now used as a stable currency in several star systems. The Intergalactic Monetary Fund had officially recognized breakfast points as a legitimate form of exchange, and several planets had switched their entire economies to a system based on the production and distribution of comfort food. But perhaps the most significant change was the simple fact that the galaxy had learned to share meals. What had once been considered a purely functional necessity, the consumption of nutrients for survival, had become a social activity, a form of communication, and a way of building relationships across species barriers. Families that had never eaten together began gathering for regular meals. Diplomatic negotiations were conducted over carefully prepared dinners. Business deals were sealed with handshakes and shared desserts. The simple act of eating had become a cornerstone of galactic civilization. "It's funny," Clicksnorp observed during one of their regular planning meetings, "how something as basic as hunger could bring us all together." "Not hunger," Jeremiah corrected gently. "The recognition that we're all hungry, and the willingness to do something about it." The great cosmic restaurant, as it had come to be known, had become more than just a place to eat. It was a symbol of what was possible when beings chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over ignorance, and caring over indifference. Visitors would often spend hours just watching the interactions between different species, marveling at the sight of natural enemies sharing recipes, hereditary foes arguing about proper seasoning techniques, and ancient rivals working together to create new fusion cuisines. "This place," a travel writer from the Andromeda Galaxy had written in his review, "is proof that the universe has a sense of humor. Who else but a cosmic comedian would arrange for the galaxy's greatest peace treaty to be negotiated over breakfast?" But Jeremiah, who had started the whole thing by sharing his last meal with a stranger, preferred to think of it as simply doing what any decent person would do when they noticed someone was hungry. He'd offered them something to eat. The philosophy had spread beyond food, influencing everything from interstellar politics to xenobiological research. The principle of noticing when someone is in need and doing something about it had become a cornerstone of galactic civilization, applied to everything from medical care to educational opportunities to disaster relief. The Great Feeding, as historians had finally settled on calling it, had proven that the most complex problems sometimes had the simplest solutions. And sometimes the best way to change the universe was to start by making someone a really good breakfast. Years later, when scholars studied the period known as the Great Galactic Peace, they would point to dozens of factors: economic interdependence, cultural exchange, technological advancement, and improved communication systems. But those who had lived through it knew the truth was simpler. The galaxy had learned to eat together, and everything else had followed from that. In the end, The historians settled on calling it the Great Feeding, which seemed appropriate for an event that had started with one hungry alien and a plate of scrambled eggs and ended with the galaxy learning to care for each other through the simple act of sharing meals. But Jeremiah, who had started the whole thing by sharing his last meal with a stranger, preferred to think of it as simply doing what any decent person would do when they noticed someone was hungry. After all, in a universe where most problems seemed impossibly complex and most solutions required committees, regulations, and enormous amounts of paperwork, there was something beautifully simple about the idea that sometimes the best way to change the world was to remember that everyone gets hungry, and everyone deserves to know that someone cares enough to cook them something good.